Liberia, officially the Republic of Liberia, is a country on the West African coast. Liberia means "land of the free" in Latin. It is bordered by Sierra Leone to its west, Guinea to its north and Ivory Coast to its east. It covers an area of 111,369 square kilometers and is home to 4,503,000 people. English is the official language and over 20 indigenous languages are spoken, representing the numerous tribes who make up more than 95% of the population. Forests on the coastline are composed mostly of salt-tolerant mangrove trees, while the more sparsely populated inland has forests opening onto a plateau with drier grasslands. The climate is equatorial, with significant rainfall during the May-October rainy season and harsh harmattan winds the remainder of the year. Liberia possesses about 40% of the remaining Upper Guinean rainforest. It was an important producer of rubber in the early 20th century. The Republic of Liberia, formerly a colony of the American Colonization Society, declared its independence on July 26, 1847. The United States did not recognize Liberia's independence until February 5, 1862. Between January 7, 1822 and the American Civil War, more than 15,000 freed African Americans and 3,198 Afro-Caribbeans settled in the country. The African American colonists carried their culture with them to Liberia. The Constitution and flag were modeled after those of the United States. In January 3, 1848, Joseph Jenkins Roberts, an African American colonist, was elected as Liberia's first black president after the country declared independence. Liberia was the first African nation to gain its independence, although other nations were independent as they had not been colonized yet. Liberia is Africa's oldest republic. Neither it nor Ethiopia were controlled or colonized by European powers during the 19th century takeover of certain areas. With the help of the United States, Liberia maintained its independence during the European colonial era. During World War II, the United States invested in considerable infrastructure in Liberia to help the war effort, which also aided the country in modernizing and improving its major transportation facilities. In addition, President William Tubman encouraged economic changes. Internationally, Liberia was a founding member of League of Nations, United Nations and the Organization of African Unity. Long-standing political tensions from indigenous ethnic groups long excluded from power resulted in a military coup in 1980 that overthrew the true Whig Party leadership, marking the beginning of political instability. 5 years of military rule by the People's Redemption Council and 5 years of civilian rule by the National Democratic Party of Liberia were followed by 2 civil wars, the First and Second Liberian Civil Wars. These resulted in the deaths of between 250,000 and 520,000 people and devastated Liberia's economy. A peace agreement in 2003 led to democratic elections in 2005. Recovery proceeds, but about 85% of the population live below the international poverty line. Liberia's economic and political stability was threatened by an Ebola virus epidemic. It originated in Guinea in December 2013 and entered Liberia in March 2014. The outbreak was declared officially ended on May 8, 2015, after 42 days with no new cases, while there have been cases since. As of the 2nd of December 2015, update. History. The Pepper Coast, also known as the Grain Coast, has been inhabited by indigenous peoples of Africa at least as far back as the 12th century and perhaps earlier. Menda-speaking people expanded westward from the Sudan, forcing many smaller ethnic groups southward toward the Atlantic Ocean. The Dei, Bassa, Kru, Gola and Kissa were some of the earliest documented peoples in the area. This influx was compounded by the decline of the Western Sudanic Mali Empire in 1375 and the Songhair Empire in 1591. Additionally, as inland regions underwent desertification, inhabitants moved to the wetter coast. These new inhabitants brought skills such as cotton spinning, cloth weaving, iron smelting, rice and sorghum cultivation, and social and political institutions from the Mali and Songhae empires. Shortly after the Maine conquered the region, the Vai people of the former Mali Empire immigrated into the Grand Cape Mountain region. The ethnic Kru opposed the influx of Vai, forming an alliance with the Maine to stop further influx of Vai. People along the coast built canoes and traded with other West Africans from Cape Verde to the Gold Coast. Arab traders entered the region from the north, and had a long-established slave trade, taking captives to areas of North and East Africa. Between 1461 and late 17th century, Portuguese, Dutch and British traders had contacts and trading posts in the region. The Portuguese named the area Costa da Pimenta, but it later came to be known as the Grain Coast, due to the abundance of Melgeta pepper grains. European traders would barter various commodities and goods with local people. Years of slave trade. When the Kru people began trading with Europeans, they initially traded in commodities. In the 16th century, they began participating directly in the African slave trade. They raided their neighbors and sold captives to the Europeans, especially those taken after armed conflict. The Kru language family includes many groups with distinct dialects, some of which are classified as different languages. In some areas, these are mutually intelligible. The Kru people dominated what became southern Liberia and the northwest of the Ivory Coast. Other peoples occupied much of the northern and inland areas, such as the Cape El, Bassa, Grebo, Geo, and Mano. The traders and later colonists came into contact with the Grebo people of the coast, who spoke what is now classified as seaside Grebo. Because of that, the Europeans and later American colonists tended to identify all natives of this area as Grebo. Some of the coastal peoples intermarried or had unions with the traders, forming a mixed-race and bilingual community in the ports. Those indigenous people who had the most contact with Europeans adopted some of their customs and styles. Some worked as translators or sailed with European ships. They developed more of a creolized culture along the coast, as compared to inland chiefdoms who maintained traditions due to relative isolation. In 1808, the United States ended its participation in the international slave trade, as did Great Britain. Both nations used their navies to intercept slave traders off the coast of Africa to end the Atlantic slave trade. Spain continued to import slaves to its colonies in the Americas, and slaves were smuggled from there into the United States. But the volume of the slave trade dropped dramatically with this change. Africans who had made money from the trade resented the interference of these nations. Great Britain had set up the colony of Freetown to the west of the Grain Coast. It supported settlement there of the Black Poor of London and black loyalists who had been resettled in Nova Scotia. Both groups were freed. African American slaves whom the British had evacuated as promised after the American Revolutionary War. The new colony was another attempt to resettle them. Before the colony of Liberia was established, both the U.S. and British navies would take liberated slaves to Sierra Leone for resettlement. When they had freedom from illegal slave ships, colonization in the United States, there was a similar movement to resettle American free blacks and freed slaves in Africa. The American Colonization Society was founded in 1816 in Washington, D.C. for this purpose, by a group of prominent politicians and slaveholders. But its membership grew to include mostly people who supported abolition of slavery. Slaveholders wanted to get free people of color out of the South, where they were thought to threaten the stability of the slave societies. Some abolitionists collaborated on relocation of free blacks, as they were discouraged by discrimination against him in the North and believed they would never be accepted in the larger society. Most African Americans, who were native-born by this time, wanted to improve conditions in the United States rather than emigrate. Leading activists in the North strongly opposed the acts, but some free blacks were ready to try a different environment. In 1822, the American Colonization Society began sending African American volunteers to the Pepper Coast to establish a colony for freed African Americans. By 1867, the acts had assisted in the migration of more than 13,000 African Americans to Liberia. These free African Americans and their descendants married within the community and came to identify as Americo-Liberians. Many were of mixed race and educated in American culture. They did not identify with the indigenous natives of the tribes they encountered. They intermarried largely within the colonial community, developing an ethnic group that had a cultural tradition infused with American notions of political republicanism and Protestant Christianity. The ACS, a private organization supported by prominent American politicians such as Abraham Lincoln, Henry Clay, and James Monroe, believed repatriation of free blacks was preferable to widespread emancipation of slaves. Similar state-based organizations established colonies in Mississippi in Africa and the Republic of Maryland, which were later annexed by Liberia. The Americo-Liberian settlers did not identify with the indigenous peoples they encountered, especially those in communities of the more isolated bush. They knew nothing of their cultures, languages, or animist religion. Encounters with tribal Africans in the bush often developed as violent confrontations. The colonial settlements were raided by the Kru and Grebo people from their inland chiefdoms, because of feeling set apart and superior by their culture and education to the indigenous peoples. The Americo-Liberians developed as a small elite that held on to political power. It excluded the indigenous tribesmen from birthright citizenship in their own lands until 1904, in a repetition of the United States' treatment of Native Americans. Because of the cultural gap between the groups and assumption of superiority of Western culture, the Americo-Liberians envisioned creating a Western-style state to which the tribesmen should assimilate. They encouraged religious organizations to set up missions and schools to educate the indigenous peoples. Government. On July 26, 1847, the settlers issued a Declaration of Independence and promulgated a constitution. Based on the political principles denoted in the United States Constitution, it established the independent Republic of Liberia. The leadership of the new nation consisted largely of the Americo-Liberians, who initially established political and economic dominance in the coastal areas that had been purchased by the ACS. They maintained relations with United States contacts in developing these areas and the resulting trade. Their passage of the 1865 Ports of Entry Act prohibited foreign commerce with the inland tribes, ostensibly to encourage the growth of civilized values. Before such trade was allowed. By 1877, the Americo-Liberian True Whig Party was the most powerful political power in the country. It was made up primarily of people from the Americo-Liberian ethnic group, who maintained social, economic and political dominance well into the 20th century, repeating patterns of European colonists in other nations in Africa. Competition for office was usually contained within the party. A party nomination virtually ensured election. Pressure from the United Kingdom, which controlled Sierra Leone to the west, and France with interests in the north and east, led to a loss of Liberia's claims to extensive territories. Both Sierra Leone and the Ivory Coast annexed some territories. Liberia struggled to attract investment in order to develop infrastructure and a larger, industrial economy. There was a decline in production of Liberian goods in the late 19th century and the government struggled financially, resulting in indebtedness on a series of international loans. 20th century. For a period of time in the early 20th century, Liberia became a U.S. protectorate. American and other international interests emphasized resource extraction, with rubber production a major industry in the early 20th century. In the mid-20th century, Liberia gradually began to modernize with American assistance. During World War II, the United States made major infrastructure improvements to support its military efforts in Africa and Europe. It built the Freeport of Monrovia and Roberts International Airport under the Lend-Lease program before its entry into the world. After the war, President William Tubman encouraged foreign investment in the country. Liberia had the second highest rate of economic growth in the world during the 1950s. Liberia also began to take a more active role in international affairs. It was a founding member of the United Nations in 1945 and became a vocal critic of the South African apartheid regime. Liberia also served as a proponent both of African independence from the European colonial powers and of Pan-Africanism, helping to fund the Organization of African Unity. On April 12, 1980, a military coup led by Master Sergeant Samuel Doe of the Kran ethnic group overthrew and killed President William R. Tolbert, Jr. Doe and the other plotters later executed a majority of Tolbert's cabinet and other Americo-Liberian government officials and true Whig Party members. The coup leaders formed the People's Redemption Council to govern the country, a strategic Cold War ally of the West. Doe received significant financial backing from the United States, while critics condemned the PRC for corruption and political repression. After Liberia adopted a new constitution in 1985, Doe was elected president in subsequent elections, which were internationally condemned as fraudulent. On November 12, 1985, a failed counter-coup was launched by Thomas Kwiwankpa, whose soldiers briefly occupied a national radio station. Government repression intensified in response, as Doe's troops executed members of the Geo and Mano ethnic groups in Nimba County. The National Patriotic Front of Liberia, a rebel group led by Charles Taylor, launched an insurrection in December 1989 against Doe's government with the backing of neighboring countries such as Burkina Faso and Ivory Coast. This triggered the First Liberian Civil War. By September 1990, Doe's forces controlled only a small area just outside the capital, and Doe was captured and executed that month by rebel forces. The rebels soon split into various factions fighting one another. The Economic Community Monitoring Group under the Economic Community of West African States organized a military task force to intervene in the crisis. From 1989 to 1996, one of Africa's bloodiest civil wars ensued, claiming the lives of more than 200,000 Liberians and displacing 1 million others into refugee camps in neighboring countries. A peace deal between warring parties was reached in 1995, leading to Taylor's election as president in 1997. Under Taylor's leadership, Liberia became internationally known as a pariah state due to the use of blood diamonds and illegal timber exports to fund the Revolutionary United Front in the Sierra Leone Civil War. The Second Liberian Civil War began in 1999 when Liberians united for reconciliation and democracy. A rebel group based in the northwest of the country launched an armed insurrection against Taylor. 2000s In March 2003, a second rebel group, Movement for Democracy in Liberia, began launching attacks against Taylor from the southeast. Peace talks between the factions began in Accra in June of that year, and Taylor was indicted by the Special Court for Sierra Leone for crimes against humanity that same month. By July 2003, the rebels had launched an assault on Monrovia. Under heavy pressure from the international community and the Domestic Women of Liberia Mass Action for Peace movement, Taylor resigned in August 2003 and went into exile in Nigeria. A peace deal was signed later that month. The United Nations mission in Liberia began arriving in September 2003 to provide security and monitor the peace accord, and an interim government took power the following October. The subsequent 2005 elections were internationally regarded as the most free and fair in Liberian history. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the Harvard-trained economist and former Minister of Finance, was elected as the first female president in Africa. Upon her inauguration, Sirleaf requested the extradition of Taylor from Nigeria and transferred him to the FXXX for trial in The Hague. In 2006, the government established a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to address the causes and crimes of the Civil War.